The grandeur of ancient Rome often blinds us to the dark underbelly of its society. Known for their unmatched engineering, military dominance, and philosophical contributions, the Romans were also masters of control through fear. Their justice system, while organized and methodical, often relied on bizarre, gruesome punishments to enforce order and suppress dissent. Let's dive deep into the strange and cruel world of Roman punishments, stories that reveal a society obsessed with both spectacle and order. Imagine this. You are accused of one of the most heinous crimes imaginable, killing a parent. In Roman society, such an act wasn't just a crime against family, but an assault on the moral fabric of society itself. The Romans called this crime parricidium, and the punishment for it was the infamous Poena Cullei, or the punishment of the sack. The process was theatrical in its cruelty. First, the criminal was stripped, flogged, and often humiliated publicly. Then, he was sewn into a large leather sack. But the Romans didn't stop there. Alongside the condemned, a dog, a snake, a monkey, and a rooster were also thrown into the sack. Why this bizarre choice of animals? Each animal carried symbolic weight. The monkey, seen as chaotic and unpredictable, represented the disorder the crime had brought. The snake embodied treachery, while the dog and rooster, loyal and vigilant animals, symbolized the betrayal of familial trust. Once the sack was sealed, it was tossed into a river. As the sack sank, the thrashing animals would panic, clawing and biting at the condemned, adding to the terror of drowning. This punishment wasn't just about death. It was about dishonor, chaos, and a final act of humiliation before the gods. One can only imagine the sheer terror of those final moments. The Colosseum, one of Rome's most iconic structures, wasn't just a marvel of architecture, it was a theater of death. For many, this massive amphitheater symbolized the power of the Roman Empire. But for the condemned, it was a stage of unimaginable horror. The Romans believed that justice should be public and serve as a warning to all. Criminals, especially those guilty of treason, murder, or theft, were often sentenced to die in the arena. These punishments weren't straightforward executions. They were theatrical performances. One chilling example involved criminals reenacting famous myths. A man guilty of heinous crimes might be forced to play the role of Icarus, only to be burned alive as wax wings melted on his back. Others were cast as Orpheus, torn apart by beasts, reflecting the tragic end of the mythological figure. The spectacle didn't stop there. Damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to beasts, was a crowd favorite. Unarmed and naked, criminals were thrown into the arena to face lions, leopards, and bears. The animals, often starved to ensure maximum ferocity, pounced on their helpless prey as thousands of spectators roared in approval. For the Romans, this wasn't just punishment, it was entertainment, a grotesque blend of justice and spectacle. Few methods of execution were as agonizing or as humiliating as crucifixion. Reserved for slaves, rebels, and the most despised criminals, it wasn't just about death. It was about prolonged suffering and public shame. Crucifixion began with scourging, where the condemned was whipped with flagrum, a multi-thonged whip embedded with bone fragments and metal. This brutal beating often left the victim's back flayed, exposing muscles and bone. Weak and bleeding, the condemned was then forced to carry the heavy wooden crossbeam to the execution site, a journey meant to strip them of any remaining dignity. Once at the site, the victim's hands and feet were nailed or tied to the cross. Hanging in this position caused excruciating pain, as the weight of the body made it nearly impossible to breathe. Death came slowly, often after hours or even days, from a combination of suffocation, dehydration, and exposure. One of the most infamous instances of mass crucifixion followed the Spartacus Rebellion. In 71 BCE, after the slave uprising was crushed, over 6,000 captured rebels were crucified along the Appian Way. This gruesome line of crosses stretched for miles, serving as a grim warning to any who dared challenge Roman authority. High above the bustling streets of Rome loomed the Tarpeian Rock, a steep cliff with a dark reputation. For centuries, this site served as a place of execution for traitors and criminals. The condemned were dragged through the city streets before being hauled to the edge of the cliff. Here, Roman officials would pronounce their final judgment, and with a shove, the criminal was sent plunging to their death. The rock itself carried a sinister history. It was named after Tarpeia, a Roman woman who betrayed the city to the Sabines in exchange for gold. Her betrayal was met with poetic justice. She was crushed under the very shield she had sought to gain. From that moment on, the Tarpeian Rock became a symbol of punishment for treachery, its legend haunting Rome for generations. The Vestal Virgins, keepers of Rome's sacred flame, were held in the highest regard. Their vow of chastity was seen as vital to the safety and prosperity of the city. But if a Vestal Virgin broke her vow, the punishment was both brutal and symbolic. Because it was considered sacrilegious to spill a Vestal's blood, the punishment was live burial. The condemned virgin was led through the city in a solemn procession, dressed in funeral attire. She was placed in a small underground chamber with a few days' rations of food and water, a macabre gesture of mercy, and left to die. Of the most infamous cases involved a Vestal Virgin named Cornelia, accused of breaking her vow in 216 BCE. Despite her protests of innocence, she was buried alive. The city's silence as the chamber was sealed was a stark contrast to the bustling streets above, a chilling reminder of the consequences of failing the gods. Slaves in ancient Rome were seen as property, and their punishments reflected this dehumanizing status. One of the most horrifying examples of collective punishment came after the murder of a Roman nobleman, Pedanius Secundus. When it was discovered that one of Pedanius's slaves was the murderer, Roman law mandated that every slave in the household, over 400 in total, be executed. Despite public outcry, the Senate upheld the ruling, emphasizing the importance of deterring rebellion among slaves. Punishments for individual slaves were equally brutal. Runaways were often branded on the forehead with the letters FUG, fugitivus, or fugitive, and subjected to whipping, starvation, or execution. The punishments of ancient Rome were more than just retribution. They were tools of power, designed to maintain order and instill fear. These methods, shocking and cruel, reveal a society that valued spectacle, control, and a rigid sense of justice above all else. As we reflect on these bizarre and brutal practices, we are reminded of how far humanity has come and how far we still have to go. The stories of these punishments, while horrifying, serve as a window into the complexities of a civilization that shaped much of the world we know today.